December 1940. The world was on fire. German U-boats ruled the Atlantic. British merchant ships were being torn apart beneath the waves, thousands of tons of supplies vanishing each week. If the convoys stopped, Britain would starve. America wasn't in the war yet, but everyone knew it was coming. And across the ocean, a desperate British government sent one simple request to Washington. Send us ships, as many as you can, as fast as you can. The problem? Building a single cargo vessel took over 230 days. The United States couldn't possibly outbuild the losses Germany was inflicting. Traditional shipyards were already working at full capacity and running out of time. Then, from the unlikeliest corner of American industry, a name surfaced: Henry Kaiser. A man who had never built a ship, a man whose empire was made of concrete, not steel. Kaiser's resume read like the opposite of what the crisis required. He built dams, the Hoover, the Grand Coulee, the Bonneville, massive monuments of stone and water control. He was a construction man, not a mariner. So when he walked into the U.S. Maritime Commission in late 1940 and declared, "I can build you 30 ships for Britain in under 2 years," the reaction was almost unanimous: laughter. Veteran shipwrights rolled their eyes. Naval engineers muttered that he didn't understand what he was asking. The respected Bath Iron Works agreed to partner with him, not out of faith, but out of pity. They assumed they'd need to rescue him from his own overconfidence. But Kaiser wasn't trying to play by their rules. In fact, he didn't even believe them. To him, the shipbuilding industry looked frozen in time, a medieval guild disguised in modern clothing. Men still hammered red-hot rivets by hand. Blueprints were sacred documents. Every vessel was treated like a handcrafted masterpiece. Kaiser saw inefficiency where others saw tradition. And more importantly, he saw time slipping away. So he asked a question no one else dared to ask. What if ships could be built like cars? He sent his chief engineer, Clay Bedford, to Detroit to study Ford's assembly lines. Bedford returned convinced. If cars could roll off a line every few minutes, why couldn't ships roll out every few days? The traditionalists called the idea insane. They said shipbuilding could never be mass-produced, that welding couldn't replace riveting, that untrained civilians could never replace generational craftsmen. But Kaiser wasn't listening. He was already drafting blueprints, not for ships, but for an entirely new kind of shipyard. One that would break every maritime rule ever written. Because in his mind, this wasn't just about ships. It was about time, innovation, and the very belief of what Americans could accomplish when the world told them you can't. And in just 2 years, Henry Kaiser would prove that word didn't exist. When Henry Kaiser won that impossible contract, he didn't inherit a shipyard. He had to invent one from scratch. In early 1941, on a stretch of empty marshland near Richmond, California, his team began carving out what looked less like a dockyard and more like an industrial cathedral. No cobblestone slips, no centuries-old workshops. Instead, Kaiser envisioned a machine that built machines, a place where steel plates flowed like rivers and sparks rained down in a storm of progress. Traditional shipwrights believed ships had to be built keel up, one piece, one frame, one rivet at a time. It was slow, methodical, precise, and utterly unsuited for a war where days could mean the loss of entire convoys. Kaiser looked at that process and said, "That's not shipbuilding, that's sculpture." He didn't want artisans, he wanted systems. He broke each ship down into hundreds of prefabricated sections, hulls, decks, bulkheads, each built in separate workshops by independent teams, then rolled out and welded together like giant Lego blocks. It was a revolutionary heresy. Old-school engineers warned that the ships would crack apart, that welding wasn't reliable, that no one could coordinate so many moving parts. But Kaiser didn't argue, he demonstrated. He brought in ordinary Americans, farmers, mechanics, school teachers, even housewives, people who had never seen the ocean, let alone a ship, and he trained them fast. A welder's course that used to take months was reduced to 10 days. Within weeks, his shipyard was a living organism, tens of thousands of workers moving in perfect rhythm, guided by color-coded blueprints and assembly charts borrowed straight from the Ford Motor Company. Every section of a Liberty ship had its own miniature factory. The bow might be assembled at Station 12, the stern at Station 27. Each completed piece rolled out on rails to the dock, where massive cranes hoisted them into place with a precision that stunned even the skeptics. And when the first ship slid into the water, the world realized something extraordinary. Kaiser wasn't just building ships, he was building time itself. A process that once took 230 days was now down to 90, then 70, and he was just getting started. He called it the Liberty Production Miracle. The Navy called it impossible, but history would soon call it something else. The greatest industrial turnaround in human history. By 1942, Henry Kaiser shipyards had become legends of their own. His methods, once ridiculed, were now being copied across America. Every week, the newspapers reported a new record. Ships were rolling off the docks faster than the Navy could name them. But for Kaiser, that still wasn't enough. He wanted to prove something far bigger, that America could outrun destruction itself, that with the right system, even the impossible had a deadline. So he issued a challenge to his team at Richmond Yard No. 2. Let's build a ship, not in months, not in weeks, but in days. His engineers thought he'd lost his mind. Even his closest allies warned him, "Henry, if this fails, they'll call you a madman." But Kaiser didn't care. He wasn't chasing records. He was chasing proof. And so, in November 1942, thousands of workers gathered under the gray California sky as the project began, a brand new Liberty ship named SS Robert E. Peary. From the first spark, the yard moved like an orchestra. Cranes swung in perfect timing. Sections rolled on rails across the dirt like mechanical beasts. Teams worked around the clock, men and women welding through the night, the glow of molten steel lighting up the bay. Every hour shaved seconds off the old record. Every weld was a defiance of the word impossible. On the fourth day, after just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, the Robert E. Peary slid into the water, complete, seaworthy, and ready for duty. Reporters couldn't believe it. British and American officials flew in just to see if the story was real. It was. The Liberty ship that should have taken 8 months had been born in 4 days. When Kaiser stepped onto the platform and watched the ship float away, he didn't smile or boast. He simply said, "This is what happens when we stop saying it can't be done." Across the Atlantic, Britain called it America's industrial miracle. In Berlin, German intelligence dismissed it as propaganda until they realized the ships kept coming. Every week, every day, faster than their U-boats could sink them. What started as a single man's impossible idea had become the heartbeat of the Allied war machine. Henry Kaiser had turned shipbuilding into mass production and time itself into a weapon. By the time the war reached its turning point in 1944, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become a world unto themselves. Across 18 American yards, his methods, once mocked, were now the national standard. Everywhere, the same rhythm echoed: steel, sparks, and the sound of liberty taking shape. At the peak of production, America was launching 3 Liberty ships every single day. 3 lifelines for Britain, for Russia, for the entire free world. And behind those ships stood not just machines, but people. Over 190,000 workers filled Kaiser's shipyards. Tens of thousands were women, many building ships by day while raising children by night. For the first time, women welded steel instead of cooking meals, and the nation saw what had always been true: ability has no gender. Thousands more were Black Americans, hired and trained when other industries shut their doors. In Kaiser's world, skill, not skin, earned you the job. It wasn't charity, it was efficiency. The war didn't give him that vision, he gave it to the war. But perhaps Henry Kaiser's greatest legacy wasn't a ship at all. It was what he built between the ships. He saw his workers collapsing from exhaustion, families struggling to pay for medical care. And he asked another question no industrialist had dared to ask. What if we built health the same way we build ships? And so he created a small medical program, a system of clinics and care for his employees and their families. After the war, it became something far bigger: Kaiser Permanente, today one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. When the war finally ended and the last Liberty ship sailed home, Henry Kaiser didn't retire to glory. He simply moved on to the next challenge: cars, aluminum, hospitals, still chasing the same idea that had defined his life: that nothing is truly impossible if you change the way you think. In just 4 years, his yards built over 2,700 ships, a fleet that helped turn the tide of history. But perhaps his real contribution wasn't the steel or the speed. It was a lesson. Innovation isn't born from knowledge, it's born from defiance. Henry J. Kaiser, the man who didn't know how to build a ship, taught the world how to build a future. By late 1943, Henry Kaiser's vision had spread far beyond Richmond. His methods were no longer an experiment. They were the blueprint for an industrial revolution. The U.S. Maritime Commission ordered every shipyard in the nation to copy his system. Prefabrication, assembly line welding, standardized components, all of it now national policy. In Portland, Oregon, in Baltimore, in the Gulf Coast, everywhere steel met saltwater, you could feel Kaiser's fingerprints. Where others saw factories, he saw ecosystems of efficiency. Every crane, every rail, every shift was a moving part of a living machine. And together, those machines produced not just ships, but momentum. By 1944, American yards were launching more tonnage in a single month than Germany could destroy in half a year. The industrial tide had turned. And the man who had once been laughed out of boardrooms was now called the miracle builder. Step inside a Kaiser shipyard in 1943, and it didn't look like war. It looked like a city. At dawn, the sirens wailed. Floodlights cut through the morning fog. Tens of thousands of workers streamed through the gates, hard hats on, lunchboxes in hand. Women in denim overalls took up welding torches beside men twice their age. Children waited in nurseries built right next to the docks. And as steam hissed and steel sparked, you could feel something greater than machinery at work. You could feel a nation reinventing itself. Kaiser built everything his workers needed to thrive: schools, cafeterias, housing, and even theaters. He didn't just build ships, he built communities. To his managers, he said, "You can't build great ships with hungry workers," and he meant it. His yards weren't perfect. There were accidents, exhaustion, chaos, but there was also pride. The kind of pride that came from knowing your work might help end a war. Kaiser shipyards became a living experiment in equality. Before the war, women were rarely allowed near heavy industry. By 1943, they made up almost 1/3 of his entire workforce. They called them Wendy the Welders. They didn't just fill in for the men who went to war. They outperformed them in speed and precision. For thousands of Black Americans, Kaiser's doors opened when others slammed shut. He hired based on ability, not color, and demanded his foremen do the same. In his shipyards, you could see something America had long denied itself, a glimpse of what true opportunity looked like. These workers didn't just build ships, they built a new version of the American dream. When the war ended, Kaiser's shipyards fell silent. The welders put down their torches. The cranes froze mid-air. But across the ocean, other nations were taking notes. In Japan, engineers studied the Kaiser model, adapting it to rebuild a shattered economy. Decades later, those ideas became the backbone of modern shipbuilding in Japan and South Korea, nations that would go on to dominate the world's maritime industry. Kaiser's revolution had crossed oceans. It wasn't just American anymore. It was universal. History remembers Henry J. Kaiser as an industrialist, a builder, a man of action. But his real genius, the reason his name still echoes decades later, wasn't in steel or machinery. It was in how he thought. Kaiser believed that innovation wasn't a matter of intelligence, it was a matter of imagination. He once said, "Problems are only opportunities in work clothes." To him, every failure was data, every obstacle a question waiting for a better answer. He didn't wait for permission, and he didn't fear mistakes. He collected them, refined them, and built systems that grew stronger with every error. That's why he could walk into an industry he didn't understand and still change it from the inside out. He didn't see a ship as a single masterpiece of craftsmanship. He saw a process, a pattern that could be analyzed, broken down, rebuilt, and multiplied. He treated organization as the true art form of the 20th century. And beneath it all, there was a deeper philosophy, that progress belongs not to the expert, but to the beginner with the courage to see differently. He believed that the world moves forward not when the smartest person finds a new idea, but when someone too inexperienced to know the rules decides to break them anyway. Henry Kaiser proved that you don't need to be a genius to change the world. You just need to be naive enough to try. And that belief, that quiet defiance of how it's always been done, became the silent engine that drove not just his factories, but the evolution of modern industry itself. When Henry Kaiser passed away in 1967, America had already moved into the space age. Satellites orbited the Earth. Computers filled entire rooms. But the core of his thinking, the DNA of innovation, was everywhere. Every modular factory, every production line, every prefab building that rose in days instead of months, it all traced back to the same question he asked in 1940. Why can't we do it faster, smarter, better? But his legacy wasn't just mechanical. It was human, because the people who worked in his shipyards carried his spirit with them. The women who welded Liberty ships went on to become engineers and leaders. The black welders and riveters who found equality in his factories helped lay the foundation for the civil rights momentum that followed. The echoes of his revolution rippled far beyond industry. They reached into society, into medicine, into the very structure of modern life. When you walk into a hospital under the name Kaiser Permanente, you're standing in the aftershock of his vision, a system born not from profit, but from purpose, a belief that the people who build the world deserve care as much as credit. And even now, decades later, his fingerprints are everywhere, in skyscrapers built from modular panels, in ships assembled in weeks instead of years, in the rhythm of progress itself. Because Henry Kaiser didn't just build ships, he built a mindset, a refusal to accept that speed must mean compromise, that innovation must come from experts, or that ordinary people can't achieve extraordinary things. He showed the world that when courage meets organization and vision meets belief, you can bend reality itself. So when you see a towering ship glide into the sea, or a factory producing miracles faster than ever before, remember this: it all began with a man who didn't know how to build a ship, but refused to believe that meant he couldn't. Henry J. Kaiser, the man who built not just vessels of steel, but vessels of possibility.